Miracle of the Andes, 1972. The departure and the accident. It was October 12th, 1972, when a group of young Uruguayans embarked on a journey that would forever change the meaning of the word survival. They were rugby players, students, friends, full of energy and dreams. Their destination was Chile, where they would play a friendly match. The atmosphere among them was one of enthusiasm and adventure. They laughed, sang, and took photos inside the small Fairchild FH-227 plane of the Uruguayan Air Force. No one imagined that this flight would be remembered as one of the greatest human dramas of all time. The plane took off from Montevideo bound for Santiago, but weather conditions soon began to worsen. Strong winds and dense clouds covered the Andes Mountains, one of the most dangerous regions in the world for aviation. The pilot, Colonel Ferradas, and the co-pilot, La Gurara, tried to maintain their course, while the radio constantly lost contact. For safety reasons, they decided to land in Mendoza, Argentina, hoping the weather would improve. There, the group spent the night laughing and anxiously. The next day, the pilot received authorization to attempt the flight again, this time bypassing the bad weather. The plan was to cross the Andes via a more southerly route known to be calmer. At 2:18 p.m. on October 13th, the plane took off again. On board were 45 people, 40 passengers and 5 crew members. Among the passengers were the rugby team captain, Marcelo Perez, medical student Nando Parado, and his friend Roberto Canessa, who would later become symbols of courage. As the plane gained altitude, the passengers marveled at the snow-capped mountains. It was a magnificent sight until the clouds turned into a dense white wall. The pilot believed he was closer to Santiago than he actually was. Due to a navigational error, he began his descent prematurely. Suddenly, the radio transmitted a message. "We are flying over Curico, preparing for descent." But they were still far away and surrounded by mountains. Seconds later, one of the wings struck a mountain. The metallic sound was deafening. The plane began to break apart. The tail separated instantly, taking some passengers with it. The rest of the fuselage slid uncontrollably down a snow-covered slope until it came to a violent stop in a remote valley at an altitude of 3,600 meters. The silence that followed was almost supernatural. The survivors were stunned, injured, and surrounded by a scene of devastation. The cold was biting. The wind felt like a blade. Inside what remained of the plane, bodies lay scattered, friends, family, teammates. The first night was a nightmare. Without adequate shelter, the survivors used the seats and parts of the plane to protect themselves from the cold. Temperatures dropped to almost minus 30 degrees Celsius. They had neither adequate clothing nor enough food. The radio reported that the search had begun, but hope would be short-lived. In the following days, helicopters and planes flew over the region. However, the white fuselage of the Fairchild camouflaged itself in the snow. Authorities presumed the plane had crashed somewhere inaccessible. 10 days after the accident, the search was officially called off. Inside the mountain, isolated from the world, the survivors didn't know it. Each day, they hoped to hear the sound of the engines in the sky. They looked up, waved, shouted, made signals with mirrors, but no one saw them. Little by little, the truth began to set in. They were completely alone, and the worst was yet to come. The beginning of survival. The sun timidly rose over the Andes, revealing the scene of the disaster. The white snow stretched to infinity, reflecting an almost painful light for those who had barely slept. Inside the destroyed fuselage, the survivors moved slowly, trying to understand where they were and what had happened to the others. They soon realized that many friends had not survived. Among the dead were the pilot and several crew members. There were serious injuries, broken bones, deep cuts, and almost no one knew what to do. Only Nando Parado, the young medical student, and Roberto Canessa, who also studied medicine, tried to improvise bandages using pieces of clothing and belts. The first task was to find food. They searched the entire plane. They found only a few chocolate bars, a bottle of wine, some nuts, and a handful of caramels. Nothing that could feed the approximately 40 survivors for very long. Even so, they decided to divide everything equally. A small piece of chocolate a day, a wine cap shared among 3 people. That was all that remained of civilization. That first morning, they still believed rescue would arrive soon, but the radio brought news that shattered all hope. The search has been suspended until further notice. A heavy silence fell over everyone. They finally understood that they were alone, completely isolated in one of the most unforgiving mountains on the planet. The cold was a constant enemy. At night, the temperature dropped so low that the air seemed to take their breath away. They huddled inside the plane, trying to keep warm. They used torn seats as mattresses and makeshift blankets made from clothing and pieces of thermal insulation from the fuselage. The frozen ground burned their skin, and the dry air made their lips bleed. Even in this scenario, there were moments of humanity. Sometimes someone would tell jokes, try to sing a song, or reminisce about childhood stories, as if they wanted for a few moments to forget where they were. But reality soon set in. Hunger began to sap their strength. As the days passed, the chocolate pieces ran out. The wine was consumed. There was nothing left. And then came the most difficult dilemma a human being can face. The bodies of their dead friends lay there, preserved by the cold. For days, no one dared even mention what everyone was thinking. But death by starvation already loomed over the group. It was then that Roberto Canessa, after much anguish, said in a low voice, "If we do nothing, we will all die. They would understand." The group discussed at length. They cried, prayed, doubted, but in the end they came to the conclusion that, to survive, they would need to do the unthinkable, feed on the flesh of their deceased companions. This moment marked the beginning of a new phase, not only of physical survival, but of spiritual survival. Many wept before taking the first step. Others initially refused, preferring to fast. But with time, necessity overcame repulsion. The human instinct for life prevailed, and, paradoxically, that act of desperation kept hope alive. Now, they knew they had a chance. Even so, the suffering was immense. There were wounded whose condition worsened each day, and infections became fatal. The body of one of the women in the group, Nando Parado's mother, died days later. Soon after, his sister also succumbed. Nando, in shock, remained silent for days. Until one morning he looked at the mountains and said, "I'm not going to die here." These words, simple but powerful, rekindled something in everyone. Nando and Roberto began to study the surrounding terrain, trying to understand where they were. They used parts of the plane to improvise a compass and began to plan an expedition. They knew it would be risky. Any unprepared hike meant almost certain death. But they also knew that staying meant the same. Meanwhile, the snow didn't let up. Intense storms swept through the valley, and the group took turns keeping the plane's entrance free of ice. At night, the sound of the wind resembled the roar of a hungry animal. Isolation, fear, and pain began to affect everyone's minds. And then, on October 29th, a new blow. An avalanche struck the fuselage, burying part of the plane and killing 8 people instantly. Among them were some of the strongest and most experienced. The small shelter turned into an ice chamber. For hours, the survivors fought to free themselves, digging with their hands and shouting each other's names. When they finally managed to get out, despair gave way to silent resignation. Now only 19 remained. Faith became the last thread keeping them standing. Some improvised crosses with pieces of metal, others prayed together every night. At each dawn, they looked to the horizon, hoping to see something. A helicopter, a light, a sign of life. But they only saw more mountains. And it was there, amidst the ice, hunger, and death, that the idea was born that would change everyone's destiny: to cross the Andes on foot. Desperation and extreme decisions. The days passed slowly, as if time had frozen along with the mountain. The cold was no longer just a sensation, it was a permanent state. Clothes were already stiff from the ice, and faces burned by the snow reflected weeks of suffering. Inside the fuselage, silence became a constant companion, broken only by coughs, murmurs, and prayers. The avalanche had taken more friends, more hope, and above all, more human warmth. Those who remained lived between horror and faith. Many no longer believed in rescue. Improvised food, made with small pieces of frozen meat from their companions, remained their only means of sustenance. What had once been an unthinkable sacrifice was now routine. It was as if, little by little, the mountain was testing the limits of humanity. Nando Parrado, who had lost his mother and sister, began to change. The pain gave way to an almost supernatural determination. He spent hours contemplating the horizon, trying to visualize a path. He was certain that salvation lay beyond those mountains. "If there is life out there, I will find it," he said. Along with him, Roberto Canessa also believed that remaining there was a slow death. And when the weather finally improved, after weeks of blizzards, they decided that the time had come. The idea was simple in theory, but almost suicidal in practice. To cross one of the most inhospitable mountain ranges on the planet, without adequate clothing, without equipment, and with very little food. Even so, Nando and Roberto began to prepare. With the help of friends, they built a kind of makeshift sleeping bag using airplane linings and pieces of insulating blanket. They tied pieces of fabric to their feet, like boots, and kept small pieces of meat in a cloth. Every detail could mean the difference between life and death. Before leaving, Nando gathered the group. His voice was firm but emotional. "If we make it, we'll come back with help. If not, try to survive as long as you can. But I promise I'll be back." On December 12th, they left the fuselage. The snow shone with an almost unreal light. Behind them, the group watched in silence. It was like seeing two brothers marching into the unknown. The walk was brutal from the first step. The thin air made every breath painful. The cold cut through their skin even under the sun. The altitude made them dizzy, and hunger was a constant presence. They slept in holes dug in the snow, huddled together to avoid freezing. In the first few days, they climbed slopes so steep they seemed like walls. With each step, the fear of falling and disappearing was real. When they finally reached the mountain summit, Nando looked around, and what he saw shocked him. Before him was no Chile, no verdant valleys, no cities, only more mountains, an endless sea of snow-capped peaks. For a moment, he thought of giving up, but Roberto looked at him and said, "If we give up now, everyone dies." And they continued. During the crossing, they faced temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius, sunburn, and foot injuries. But the worst part was the psychological impact. The solitude, the silence of the mountains, the echo of the wind. Everything seemed to mock hope. On the fourth day, they found a slightly lower area with rocks and sparse vegetation. There they stopped. Nando's body trembled with exhaustion, but his mind remained firm. He looked at Canessa and said, "Now I know we can." And indeed, they could. After more than a week of walking, they spotted something on the horizon, a dark mountain range, and beyond it, a snowless valley. Their hearts raced. This could be the Chilean side. Salvation seemed finally near. But there was one last obstacle, a deep, icy canyon separating the mountains from the valley. Descending it seemed impossible. Even so, with improvised ropes and a lot of courage, they succeeded. With each step, they left the impossible behind. On the 9th day of walking, the two were exhausted. Their lips bled, their legs barely responded. They stopped by a river and looked around, and then they saw something they hadn't seen for 70 days. Human tracks, footprints. They ran or tried to run. They desperately shouted for help. And then, on the other side of the river, a man on horseback appeared, a Chilean peasant. Nando tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. He shouted with what little strength he had left, "Help! Help! Friends, Uruguayan plane." The man didn't understand immediately, but he sensed the urgency. He tossed them a piece of paper and a pencil. Nando wrote, trembling, "We came from a plane that crashed in the mountains. We are Uruguayans. We have been here for more than 70 days. We need help, please." The message was delivered, and at that moment, for the first time in more than 2 months, hope was real. The final crossing and the rescue. The Chilean farmer disappeared into the distance, carrying the note in his hands. On the other side of the river, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa remained seated, too weak even to celebrate. They had accomplished the impossible, but they were not yet saved. They spent the night there in the biting cold, praying that the man had understood the message. The next morning, they heard a sound they had dreamed of hearing for months, the trot of horses and human voices. The same farmer, accompanied by other men, had returned. One of them shouted, "Let's help them! The police and the army will arrive tomorrow." Tears came before the words. After 72 days isolated in that icy hell, they had finally been found. The farmers gave them food, bread, cheese, and fruit, but the two could barely eat. Their bodies no longer knew how to react to real food. What they felt, above all, was relief. A relief as great as the pain they carried. The next morning, a rescue team arrived in the valley. Nando guided them back to the exact spot where the plane had crashed, kilometers away and almost 4,000 meters high. He knew that there, in the heart of the mountain, there were still 14 people alive, waiting. The rescue plan began immediately. Helicopters from the Chilean Air Force were sent, but the strong winds and treacherous terrain made each flight a risk. Even so, the pilots took the risk, and when they sighted the white fuselage of the Fairchild, the whole world turned its eyes to that forgotten corner of the earth. Upon hearing the sound of the helicopters, the remaining survivors ran out, screaming, crying, and waving pieces of cloth. They had won. The first helicopter landed with difficulty. Armed men and rescuers jumped into the snow and were confronted with a scene they would never forget. Cadaverous faces, bodies covered in wounds, and eyes that shone with a mixture of despair and faith. One of the soldiers later recounted, "I have never seen human beings so close to death and so full of life at the same time." That day, December 22nd, 1972, the first rescued were taken to Chile. The next day, the rest of the group was evacuated. It was 72 days of horror, cold, and courage. The world was in shock. The headlines proclaimed, "Miracle in the Andes," and it wasn't an exaggeration. Doctors stated that, biologically, it was almost impossible for them to have survived so long at that altitude with so few resources. But controversy soon arose. When the survivors recounted everything, including the act of cannibalism necessary for survival, many reacted with astonishment. But over time, public opinion changed. Priests, theologians, and even Pope Paul VI declared that what they did was not a sin, but an act of life. What was once seen as horror came to be understood as courage. The survivors returned to Uruguay and were received as heroes. There were only 16 of them, 16 people who defied death and overcame the impossible. Each of them carried physical and emotional scars, but also one certainty: they would never be the same again. Nando Parrado became a speaker, telling the world about the value of life and human strength. Roberto Canessa became a pediatrician dedicated to saving lives. Marcelo Perez, the captain, and those who remained behind were immortalized as symbols of courage. Years have passed, but the miracle of the Andes has never been forgotten. The site of the tragedy has been transformed into a simple memorial marked by a cross made from pieces of the plane. Those who visit the site feel a different kind of silence, a silence of reverence, not fear. The story has been told in books, films, and documentaries, but no version can fully convey what those men experienced: the pain, the despair, the faith, and above all, the indomitable will to survive. Nando, in an interview years later, simply summarized what he learned. "On that mountain, I discovered what really matters. I discovered that human beings are much stronger than they imagine, and that, even in the coldest darkness, there is always a spark of light. That spark saved 16 lives, and this forever ignited the flame of testimony that even in the face of the impossible, the human spirit is capable of miracles.